The rock fell behind him with a sound that echoed like thunder. For a moment, Jonathan Hale didn't understand what had happened. Dust filled the air. His flashlight beams shook wildly across the cave walls. Then he turned around, and his heart stopped. The entrance was gone. Not blocked, gone. Where there had been an opening to the outside world only seconds before, there was now a solid wall of collapsed stone. Jonathan stared at it in disbelief. No, no, no. His voice sounded small in the massive cave. He rushed forward, grabbing at the rocks with his bare hands. Sharp edges cut into his palms. Small stones shifted, but the mountain did not move. Thousands of pounds of rock sealed the exit. Jonathan stepped back slowly. His chest tightened. He forced himself to breathe. He had faced billion-dollar crises before. Hostile takeovers, market crashes, lawsuits that could destroy companies overnight. But none of those things had ever made his body shake like this, because those problems had solutions. This one might not. Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. No signal. He checked again. Still nothing. His battery read 31%. He laughed quietly. The sound echoed through the cave in a way that made the situation feel even more unreal. 31% battery, billions of dollars in the bank, and not a single bar of signal. The irony was almost funny. Almost. Jonathan turned on his flashlight again and studied the cave around him. It was larger than he remembered. Rough stone walls curved upward into darkness. The air was damp, cold, and the silence felt alive. He shouted, "Hello!" His voice echoed again and again, but no one answered. No rescue team, no hikers, no helicopter, nothing. Jonathan leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he realized something terrifying. The world had no idea where he was. Jonathan Hale was a man used to control. At 46 years old, he owned one of the largest technology companies in the world. News magazines called him the architect of modern industry. Financial analysts called him ruthlessly efficient. Employees often called him something else when he wasn't around, but no one ever called him weak. He built his empire from nothing, a scholarship student, a brilliant engineer. A man who believed that the world belonged to those who moved faster than everyone else. And for 20 years, he had been right. But inside that cave, none of that mattered. Money could not move the rocks. Power could not create oxygen. And intelligence meant very little when the only problem left was survival. Jonathan checked his phone again. Still no signal. His flashlight battery dropped to 27%. He forced himself to stay calm. Panic wastes oxygen. He had read that once. So he sat down on a rock and tried to think. How long would it take before someone noticed he was missing? The helicopter pilot, the conference organizers, his assistant. Maybe a few hours, maybe longer, but the mountain had collapsed behind him. Even if they came looking, finding the exact cave would be almost impossible. Jonathan swallowed. The air suddenly felt thinner. Time passed slowly, too slowly. Jonathan's flashlight dimmed slightly. The cave temperature dropped as the sun moved across the sky above the mountain. He tried to conserve energy, tried to stay still, but his mind kept drifting. Back to meetings, contracts, arguments, faces he had ignored, workers he had laid off, communities he had replaced with glass towers and luxury developments. For the first time in his life, Jonathan wondered how many people had suffered because of decisions he barely remembered making. The thought surprised him. He pushed it away. Survival came first. Reflection could wait. Then suddenly he heard something. A faint sound. Footsteps. Jonathan stood up instantly. "Hello." The sound stopped. For several seconds there was silence again. Then a small voice echoed through the cave. "Mum, I think someone's here." Jonathan froze, a child, inside the cave. His flashlight beam shook as he turned toward the tunnel behind him. Two shadows appeared slowly in the darkness. A woman. And a little girl holding her hand. They stopped when the light reached them. The woman studied him carefully. Her clothes were simple, worn. The kind people wear when life is about work, not comfort. The little girl stepped forward curiously, and for the first time in hours, Jonathan Hale felt hope. Because sometimes the person who changes everything is the one you would least expect. Jonathan Hale pointed his flashlight toward them. The beam trembled slightly in his hand. For a second, he wondered if exhaustion had made him imagine them, but the woman and the little girl were real. Standing there in the dim tunnel, looking just as surprised as he was, the woman stepped forward cautiously. "Who are you?" she asked. Jonathan blinked. For the first time in years, his name suddenly felt less important than it used to. "I'm Jonathan." The woman nodded slowly. "I'm Maria." She placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "And this is my daughter, Lucia." Lucia studied Jonathan with open curiosity. "You look lost." Jonathan gave a weak smile. "That's a very accurate description." Maria moved closer to the collapsed rocks behind him. She examined the debris carefully, touching a few loose stones, testing the stability of the wall. Finally, she stepped back. "That entrance isn't opening anytime soon." Jonathan already knew that, but hearing someone else say it made the reality heavier. He rubbed his forehead. "Do you know another way out?" Maria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked deeper into the cave, thinking. Lucia spoke first. "There's the water tunnel." Maria frowned slightly. "That path is dangerous." Lucia shrugged. "So we're staying here." Jonathan looked between them. You know another exit? Maria sighed. There is a passage deeper in the mountain. How far? Maybe 40 minutes walking. Jonathan's heart lifted slightly. That's nothing. Maria shook her head. It's not a normal path. What do you mean? Lucia answered cheerfully. It's very small. Jonathan looked down at his expensive suit, then back at the dark tunnel. At this point, he said quietly, I'm not in a position to be picky. They began walking deeper into the cave. Maria led the way. Lucia followed closely behind her. Jonathan walked last, using the flashlight to guide them through the narrow passages. The cave twisted and bent like a maze, carved by water over centuries. Sometimes the ceiling dropped so low that Jonathan had to crouch. Sometimes the ground was uneven and slippery. Lucia moved easily. Clearly she had been here before. Jonathan, however, struggled. His shoes slipped on wet stones. His expensive jacket caught on sharp edges, and several times he had to stop to catch his breath. Maria noticed. You're not used to places like this. Jonathan laughed quietly. No. Lucia turned around while walking. What kind of places are you used to? Jonathan thought for a moment. Boardrooms. Lucia frowned. What's that? Jonathan smiled faintly. Rooms where people argue about money. Lucia considered that seriously. That sounds boring. Jonathan laughed again. For the first time since the cave collapse, he felt something close to calm. After 20 minutes of climbing through the tunnels, they reached a narrow underground stream. Water flowed slowly between smooth rocks. Lucia knelt beside it and filled a small metal cup. Drink, she said, handing it to Jonathan. He hesitated, but his throat was dry. The water was cold and clear, and surprisingly refreshing. Thank you, he said. Lucia smiled proudly. Maria sat down on a nearby rock. You said your name is Jonathan, she said. Yes. What were you doing on this mountain? My helicopter had to land because of fog. Lucia's eyes widened. You have a helicopter. Jonathan nodded. Lucia looked impressed. Marian did not. What do you do? Marian asked. Jonathan hesitated, then answered honestly. I run a company. What kind of company? Technology. Maria nodded politely. But it was obvious the answer meant very little to her. Lucia asked another question. Are you rich? Jonathan looked at her. Yes. Lucia thought about that. Then she said something unexpected. Then why were you alone? Jonathan didn't answer immediately, because that question was harder than any he had faced in a business meeting. Maria stood up again. We should keep moving. The tunnel ahead became even smaller. At one point, Jonathan had to crawl through a gap barely wide enough for his shoulders. His expensive watch scraped against the rock. Lucia giggled. You look funny. Jonathan grinned. I probably do. Finally, the tunnel began sloping upward. The air changed. It felt fresher, cooler. Jonathan noticed a faint glow ahead. "Is that?" Maria nodded. "Yes." Lucia ran forward excitedly. "Almost there." Jonathan climbed the last rocky slope and stepped out of the cave entrance. Sunlight hit his face, warm, bright, alive. For a moment he simply stood there, breathing. The sky above the mountain looked impossibly wide. Jonathan had seen that sky thousands of times before, but never like this. They sat on a rock outside the cave. The valley stretched below them. Lucia opened her small bag. Inside were pieces of bread and fruit. She handed one apple to Jonathan again. "You need energy." Jonathan accepted it. "You're very generous," Lucia shrugged. "My mum says sharing keeps people alive." Jonathan looked at Maria. "You saved my life today." Maria shook her head. "We just helped you walk." Jonathan smiled. "Sometimes that's the same thing." Lucia tilted her head. "So what will you do now?" Jonathan looked out at the valley again, the mountains, the small villages scattered in the distance. Then he looked back at the two people who had just guided him out of the darkness. "I think," he said slowly, "I need to start listening more." Lucia smiled. "That's good." "Why?" "Because people who listen usually learn things." Jonathan nodded. "And today, I learned something very important." Maria raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Jonathan looked back toward the cave entrance, then at them. "And sometimes the people who have the least," he paused, "are the ones who save everything." Months later, a new school and medical clinic opened near Maria's village, funded entirely by Jonathan Holly. But when reporters asked him why he invested there, Jonathan simply pointed toward Lucia. "She showed me the way out." Lucia laughed. "But you already knew the way." Jonathan smiled. "No." He looked at the mountains again. "I just didn't know it yet." Jonathan was still catching his breath when Maria suddenly looked up at the sky. The wind had changed. Dark clouds were rolling across the mountain. Lucia noticed it too. "Mum, the storm is coming." Maria nodded slowly. Jonathan followed their gaze. The sky that had looked beautiful just minutes earlier was now turning grey and violent. "How bad is it?" Jonathan asked. Maria answered honestly. "Bad enough that we shouldn't stay on this ridge." Thunder echoed across the mountains. Jonathan realized something important. They were still far from any road, still high on the mountain, still exposed. "Where do we go?" he asked. Maria pointed toward a narrow path, descending along the rocks. There was an old shelter halfway down the valley. Lucia grabbed Jonathan's hand. "Come on." They began walking quickly. The wind grew stronger. Cold air rushed across the cliffs. Within minutes, the first drops of rain began to fall. Jonathan slipped once on the wet stones. Lucia caught his arm before he fell. "Careful." Jonathan laughed nervously. I'm starting to think today isn't my lucky day. Lucia smiled. You already got lucky. How? You met us. By the time they reached the shelter, the storm had fully arrived. Rain hammered the mountain. Lightning flashed across the valley. The shelter was small, just a wooden cabin built decades ago for hikers and shepherds. Maria pushed the door open. Inside it was dark but dry. Lucia immediately began gathering small sticks near the fireplace. Fire time, she said. Jonathan watched in amazement as the little girl quickly built a small fire. You've done that before, he said. Lucia grinned. Many times. Soon the fire crackled softly. Warm light filled the cabin. For the first time all day, Jonathan felt safe. He sat down on a wooden bench. Maria sat across from him quietly. For a while no one spoke. Only the sound of rain and the crackling fire filled the room. Finally, Maria broke the silence. You're not just some businessman, are you? Jonathan looked at her. What makes you say that? Maria shrugged. You don't react to problems like normal people. Jonathan smiled faintly. That's because my problems usually involve numbers, not mountains. Lucia sat beside him. So how rich are you? Jonathan laughed. Very. Lucia thought about that carefully. Then why didn't you have someone to help you today? Jonathan looked into the fire. Because that question touched something deeper than money. Maria spoke quietly. Lucia and I weren't always alone. Jonathan looked up. My husband worked in the city, she continued. He repaired industrial machines. Jonathan felt a strange chill. Machines, factories, industry. Those things belonged to his world. One day the factory closed, Maria said. No warning, no compensation, just a letter. Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. He had seen thousands of those letters. His companies had sent many of them. What happened then? Jonathan asked. Maria stared at the fire. My husband tried to find another job, but everything was closing. Companies leaving, factories shutting down. Lucia spoke quietly. Dad got sick. Jonathan's chest tightened. Maria nodded. The hospital was too expensive, so we came back to the mountains. She looked around the small cabin. This life is harder, but at least we survive. Jonathan didn't speak, because he knew something now. Something uncomfortable. The factory Maria described might have belonged to him. Jonathan pulled out his phone again. Still no signal. But the company name Maria mentioned earlier echoed in his mind. Halle Industries, one of his subsidiaries. Jonathan leaned forward slowly. What was the name of the factory? He asked carefully. Maria answered without looking at him. Hale Manufacturing. The room went silent. Lucia looked between them. What's wrong? Jonathan stared into the fire. Because suddenly the mountain felt heavier. The cave collapse had not been the first time his decisions changed lives. but it might be the first time he had actually met the people affected. Maria noticed his expression. "What is it?" Jonathan spoke quietly. "That factory belonged to my company." Lucia blinked. "You mean, you closed it?" Jonathan swallowed. "Yes." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Lucia looked confused. Maria simply stared at the fire. Then she said something Jonathan did not expect. "We survived anyway." Jonathan looked at her. "Most people didn't," she added. The storm continued for hours. Lightning flashed across the mountains again and again. Inside the cabin, the fire slowly burned lower. Lucia eventually fell asleep beside the fireplace. Jonathan and Maria remained awake. "You didn't know about our village," Maria said calmly. Jonathan shook his head. "I saw numbers, profit reports, efficiency charts." Maria nodded. "That's how decisions are made." Jonathan looked at Lucia sleeping peacefully. "Your daughter saved my life today." Maria smiled slightly. "She saves me every day." Jonathan thought about that. About the cave, about the mountain, about the factory. And about the strange way life had brought him here. Sometimes the world changes a person slowly, but sometimes it takes one terrifying moment and two unexpected strangers. When the storm finally passed, sunlight filled the valley again. Jonathan stepped outside the cabin. The air smelled fresh, clean, alive. In the distance he heard something, a helicopter. His rescue team. Jonathan turned back toward Maria and Lucia. "They're coming." Lucia jumped excitedly. "Your helicopter." Jonathan smiled. "Yes." But as the helicopter approached, Jonathan realized something surprising. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel eager to return to his old world, because somewhere between the cave, the storm, and the small cabin, something inside him had changed. And sometimes, the most valuable thing a person can find in the dark is a new way to see the light. The helicopter sound grew louder. Jonathan stepped out of the wooden shelter and looked toward the sky. The aircraft appeared above the mountains, slowly circling the valley. Lucia waved both arms excitedly. "Over here." Jonathan could see the rescue team leaning out the side of the helicopter. They had been searching for him all night. Within minutes, the helicopter descended carefully onto a flat clearing nearby. Two men jumped out immediately. One of them ran straight toward Jonathan. "Mr. Halley?" It was Marcus, his head of security. The man looked exhausted. "We've been looking everywhere." Jonathan nodded quietly. "I figured." Marcus glanced toward Maria and Lucia. "Who are they?" Jonathan turned. "They're the reason I'm alive." Marcus didn't fully understand what that meant, but he nodded respectfully. Lucia stared at the helicopter with huge eyes. "I've never seen one so close." Jonathan smiled. Do you want to? Lucia looked at her mother. Maria hesitated, then nodded slowly. Lucia ran toward the helicopter, laughing. For a moment, the entire situation felt almost normal. Almost. But Jonathan felt something different inside him. Something heavier. 'Cause now he understood something he had never thought about before. Rescue doesn't always mean freedom. Sometimes rescue means returning to a life that needs to change. 2 hours later, Jonathan sat in the helicopter. The mountains slowly disappeared beneath them. Lucia sat by the window, amazed by the view. Maria sat quietly beside her. Marcus leaned toward Jonathan. We were about to start a full mountain search. Jonathan nodded. I know. Marcus lowered his voice. The board is already panicking. Jonathan almost laughed. Of course they are. The company depended on him. Billions of dollars, thousands of employees, entire markets reacting to his decisions. But for the first time in his life, Jonathan wasn't thinking about the company. He was thinking about Maria's story, the factory, the layoffs, the letter. He had never seen those consequences before. But now they had faces. When they landed at the hospital helipad in the city, reporters were already waiting. Cameras flashed immediately. Mr. Harley, where were you? How did you survive? Jonathan stepped out of the helicopter. Security quickly surrounded him. But before entering the building, he stopped. He turned toward Maria and Lucia. Reporters immediately noticed them. Who are they? Jonathan answered simply. The people who saved my life. Maria looked uncomfortable with the attention. Lucia waved happily. Inside the hospital, doctors checked Jonathan quickly. Mild dehydration, exhaustion, nothing serious. Marcus stood near the door. The board wants a meeting immediately, he said. Jonathan stared at the ceiling. Of course they do. Marcus hesitated. You should rest first. Jonathan shook his head. No, because something inside him had already decided what needed to happen next. The conference room on the top floor of Haley Industries was enormous. Glass walls overlooked the entire city. Directors and executives filled the table. When Jonathan walked in, the room immediately fell silent. The chairman spoke first. Jonathan, thank God you're safe. Jonathan sat down slowly. Thank you. Another executive leaned forward. We were worried about the markets. Jonathan looked at him. The markets, yes. The stock dropped 3% this morning. Jonathan stared at the table for several seconds. Then he laughed quietly. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the sound of someone realizing something absurd. I was buried under a mountain, he said calmly, and you're worried about stock prices. The room became uncomfortable. The chairman cleared his throat. Well, investors need stability. Jonathan nodded slowly. Yes, stability. Then he stood up and said something that shocked everyone in the room. We're reopening the factories. The directors looked confused. What factories? One asked. The ones we closed. Jonathan, that would cost billions. Jonathan nodded. I know. The chairman leaned forward urgently. Why would we do that? Jonathan looked out the window toward the distant mountains. Because those decisions destroyed communities that deserved better than a letter. The room fell completely silent. Jonathan continued. And because yesterday, he paused. 2 people who lost everything still chose to help me. No one argued, because the conviction in his voice was something they had never heard before. 6 months later, the valley near Maria's village looked very different. The old factory building stood open again. Workers filled the parking lot. Machines hummed inside. But this time the building was not owned by Jonathan Hale. It was owned by the community, a cooperative funded by his foundation. Lucia ran across the grass outside the building. Jonathan watched her from the entrance. Maria stood beside him. You didn't have to do all this, she said. Jonathan shook his head. Yes, I did. Lucia ran back toward them. Look, she pointed toward the mountains. The cave entrance was visible, high on the ridge. Jonathan followed her gaze. That place almost killed me, he said. Lucia smiled. No, it showed you something. Jonathan looked down at her. What's that? Lucia shrugged. That sometimes the people with the most, she paused thoughtfully, need the most help learning how to live. Jonathan laughed softly. Because the little girl was right. The cave had trapped his body, but it had also freed something much more important. His perspective, and sometimes the darkest place in the world, is exactly where a new life begins.